The red light on the National Court Network camera blinked on as 12 million Americans tuned in live. "This landmark police brutality case begins now," announced anchor Rebecca Hayes. Inside Chicago District Court, Judge Victoria Williams was about to preside over the most watched trial of the decade, the death of Marcus Williams, her own father. Officer Derek Thompson blocked the elegant black woman in the marble hallway. "Ma'am, this is a restricted area during live broadcast," he barked, his hand moving to his baton. Victoria adjusted her professional blazer calmly. "Officer, I have every right to be here." His partner Marcus Davis stepped closer, sneering. "Lady, I don't care what you think your rights are. You're disrupting a federal proceeding." She looked directly into the camera lens visible through the courtroom doors. "Then perhaps you should check who's presiding over that proceeding." Without warning, Thompson grabbed her shoulders and slammed her against the heavy oak courtroom door. The impact cracked through the live audio feed as 12 million viewers watched in horror. Victoria crashed to the cold marble floor, her head striking the brass nameplate with a sickening thud that echoed through millions of television speakers. Blood immediately began pooling beneath her dark hair. As she lay motionless on the courthouse floor, her blood staining the marble that 12 million people could see through the broadcast, Victoria slowly reached for her fallen briefcase. What she pulled out next would not only shock the nation watching live, it would expose how these two officers had crossed every line of justice. Because the woman bleeding on that floor wasn't just any victim. She was the judge who would decide the fate of these officers and prove that justice applies to everyone. The aftermath of the assault sent shockwaves through the courthouse and across the nation. Bailiff James Brown rushed through the courtroom doors to find Judge Victoria Williams lying in a pool of blood, while Officers Thompson and Davis stood over her with the casual indifference of men who believed they were above accountability. "What the hell happened here?" Brown demanded, his hand moving instinctively to his radio to call for medical assistance and FBI backup. Thompson, still breathing heavily from the assault, replied in the monotone voice he had used countless times before. "Suspect was interfering with court proceedings and became combative. She fell during the arrest." But their carefully rehearsed lies were worthless. Every second of the assault had been captured by the courthouse's sophisticated audio system and transmitted live to 12 million Americans. There would be no covering up this brutality, no hiding behind false reports and police union protection. In living rooms across America, viewers were already flooding social media with outrage. The hashtag #TalkJusticeForJudge began trending within minutes, though most people still didn't know the true identity of the woman bleeding on the courthouse floor. Inside the courtroom, Attorney Sarah Johnson heard the commotion and rushed toward the entrance. When she saw Victoria Williams on the floor, her legal mind immediately recognized the magnitude of what had occurred. This wasn't just an assault. It was a federal crime committed on live television in front of millions of witnesses. The National Court Network's technical crew struggled to maintain their broadcast, as the story shifted from a routine trial coverage to breaking news of unprecedented proportions. Director Michael Chen shouted instructions to his camera operators. "Keep rolling. This is the biggest story of the decade." Meanwhile, FBI agents who had been monitoring the trial due to its national significance were already mobilizing. Agent Maria Rodriguez received the emergency call while reviewing case files in her downtown Chicago office. "We have an assault on a federal judge in progress," came the urgent voice through her radio. "All units respond immediately." Victoria Williams stirred on the marble floor, consciousness slowly returning as the metallic taste of blood filled her mouth. The right side of her head throbbed with each heartbeat, and she could feel the warmth of blood trickling down her cheek. But her mind was crystal clear about what needed to happen next. She had come to this courthouse to seek justice for her father's death at the hands of police officers who thought they were above the law. Instead, she had become another victim of the same type of violence that had destroyed her family 3 years ago. But unlike her father, she had survived. And unlike her father's case, this assault had been witnessed by 12 million Americans in real time. The irony was devastating and perfect. These officers had just provided the nation with a live demonstration of exactly the type of police brutality that the trial was meant to address. They had proven, beyond any possible doubt, that the problem wasn't isolated incidents or bad apples. It was a systemic culture that saw certain people as less deserving of respect and protection. If you believe that no one should ever face police brutality on live television, type justice below. As paramedics arrived and news crews repositioned their cameras, Victoria Williams made a decision that would transform American justice forever. She would not just seek accountability for her father's death. She would use her own assault as evidence of why that accountability was so desperately needed. The trial that was supposed to begin that morning would proceed. But now it would serve a dual purpose, seeking justice for Marcus Williams, while demonstrating to the entire nation what happened when police officers believed they were above the law they had sworn to uphold. Officer Derek Thompson spotted the elegant black woman approaching the courtroom entrance and immediately stepped into her path. His hand instinctively moved toward his baton, a gesture that would later be analyzed frame by millions of viewers. "Ma'am, this is a restricted area during live broadcast," he barked, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "You need to move along." Victoria Williams stopped calmly, adjusting her professional blazer with the composure of someone who had faced intimidation before. Her father had taught her never to show fear, especially when confronting those who abuse their power. "Officer, I have every right to be here," she replied, her voice steady and clear. The microphones positioned throughout the courthouse picked up every word, transmitting the exchange to living rooms across America. Thompson's face hardened. He had dealt with what he called difficult people before, people who thought they knew better than law enforcement. "Lady, I don't care what you think your rights are. This is a federal proceeding and I'm telling you to move." His partner, Marcus Davis, stepped closer, forming what police called a presence barrier, an intimidation tactic designed to make civilians feel small and powerless. "Maybe you didn't hear him the first time," Davis sneered. "This area is off-limits to unauthorized personnel." Victoria looked directly at the camera lens visible through the courtroom doors, her next words carrying weight that neither officer could comprehend. "Then perhaps you should check who's presiding over that proceeding." In living rooms across America, viewers leaned forward. Something was about to happen. The tension was palpable, even through television screens. Thompson's jaw clenched. He had encountered this type of attitude before, people who thought they were above the law, who believed their education or social status gave them special privileges. In his experience, such people needed to be reminded of who really held the power. "Are you threatening a police officer?" Thompson demanded, his voice rising. "Because that's a felony, sweetheart." The word sweetheart hung in the air like a slap. Millions of viewers heard it. Civil rights attorneys across the country took notes. The casual disrespect would become evidence in itself. Victoria remained calm, but her eyes flashed with the same fire that had driven her through law school, through her judicial confirmation, through 3 years of grief and determination. "Officer Thompson," she said, reading his nameplate, "I am not threatening anyone. I am simply exercising my constitutional right to enter this courtroom." "Constitutional right?" Davis laughed mockingly. "Lady, you watch too much TV. Real life doesn't work like that." What neither officer realized was that their conversation was being broadcast live to the National Court Network's 12 million viewers. In newsrooms across the country, producers were already flagging the exchange as potentially significant. Phone calls were being made. Social media was beginning to buzz. Meanwhile, inside the courtroom, Attorney Sarah Johnson was reviewing her opening statement when she heard raised voices in the hallway. She glanced toward the entrance, wondering what could be causing a disturbance on such an important day. Bailiff James Brown also heard the commotion and moved toward the courtroom doors. As an experienced court officer, he recognized the signs of an escalating situation. His hand moved to his radio, ready to call for additional security if necessary. Back in the hallway, Thompson's patience had reached its limit. He had given this woman multiple opportunities to comply, and she continued to resist his lawful orders. In his mind, this was exactly the kind of behavior that led to unfortunate incidents. People who refused to respect authority faced the consequences of their choices. "Ma'am, I'm going to ask you one more time to move along," Thompson said, his voice now carrying an unmistakable threat. If you don't comply, I'll have to place you under arrest for interfering with a federal proceeding. Victoria Williams had faced down judges, juries, and some of the most powerful people in the legal system. She had prosecuted murderers and defended the innocent. She had presided over cases that changed lives and shaped law. But standing in that hallway, facing the same type of aggressive policing that had killed her father, she felt the weight of history pressing down upon her. "Officer," she said quietly, "I strongly advise you to reconsider your approach." Davis stepped even closer, invading her personal space in a way designed to intimidate. "And I strongly advise you to listen when a police officer gives you a lawful order." The camera crews inside the courtroom could hear the argument through the doors. One cameraman adjusted his angle to capture whatever was happening in the hallway. The sound engineers increased their gain, ensuring that every word would be recorded for posterity. In the National Court Network studio, Rebecca Hayes received a message through her earpiece. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced to her viewers, "it appears there's some kind of disturbance outside the courtroom. We're going to continue monitoring the situation." What happened next would transform a routine trial into a national crisis that would redefine police accountability in America. Thompson's hand moved to his handcuffs. Davis positioned himself to block any potential escape route. Victoria Williams stood her ground, knowing that backing down now would send the wrong message to millions of people who had suffered similar encounters. The collision between justice and injustice was about to become explosive. The tension in the courthouse hallway had reached a breaking point. Officer Derek Thompson's face was flushed with anger and frustration. This woman's refusal to obey his commands challenged everything he believed about authority and order. "That's it," Thompson snarled, his patience completely exhausted. "You're under arrest for interfering with police business." Victoria Williams straightened her shoulders, maintaining the dignity that had carried her through every challenge in her distinguished career. "Officer Thompson, I am not interfering with anything. I am simply—" "Shut up!" Thompson exploded, his voice echoing through the marble hallway and into the sensitive microphones that were broadcasting every word to 12 million Americans. "I've had enough of your attitude." Without warning, without following any de-escalation protocol, without considering that this incident was being transmitted live to a national audience, Thompson lunged forward and grabbed Victoria by both shoulders. The force of his grip was immediate and brutal. His fingers dug into her blazer as he prepared to physically remove this obstacle from his path. Victoria's eyes widened in shock, not just at the sudden violence but at the terrible familiarity of it all. This was exactly how it had started with her father. "Officer, stop," she commanded, her voice carrying judicial authority even in that moment of vulnerability. But Thompson was beyond listening. His training had taught him that physical control was the solution to resistance, and in his mind, this woman had been resisting from the moment she refused his first order. Marcus Davis moved to assist his partner, grabbing Victoria's right arm to prevent her from fighting back. Together, the two officers overpowered the 5'6" judge, their combined weight and momentum carrying her backward toward the heavy oak doors of the courtroom. Inside the courtroom, Bailiff James Brown heard the commotion and rushed toward the entrance. Attorney Sarah Johnson looked up from her notes, alarmed by the sounds of struggle. The camera crews, alerted by their sound engineers, began positioning themselves to capture whatever was happening. "Get her against the wall," Davis shouted, as if Victoria were a dangerous criminal rather than a professionally dressed woman who had been walking calmly down a public hallway. Thompson's grip tightened, his knuckles white with the force he was applying. "I told you what would happen if you didn't listen," he growled through gritted teeth. With a violent shove that would later be replayed countless times in slow motion, Thompson slammed Victoria Williams against the courtroom door. The impact was devastating. Her body struck the heavy oak with a sickening crack that reverberated through the courthouse and through the audio feed of the live broadcast. 12 million Americans heard that sound in their living rooms, their cars, their offices. It was the sound of brutality meeting innocence, of power-crushing dignity, of everything wrong with police violence condensed into a single horrible moment. Victoria's head snapped back, striking the brass nameplate mounted on the courtroom door. A nameplate that read, "Judge Victoria Williams," in elegant lettering that neither officer had bothered to read. The metallic impact echoed through millions of television speakers as Victoria collapsed to the cold marble floor. Blood immediately began pooling beneath her dark hair, spreading across the pristine courthouse marble like a crimson testimony to the violence that had just occurred. Inside the courtroom, chaos erupted. Bailiff James Brown burst through the doors to find Victoria Williams lying motionless on the floor, blood streaming from a gash on her forehead where she had struck the nameplate. "What the hell happened here?" Brown demanded, his hand moving instinctively to his radio to call for medical assistance. Thompson stood over Victoria's prone form, breathing heavily from the exertion and adrenaline. "Suspect was resisting arrest and interfering with court proceedings," he reported in the monotone voice he had used countless times before. "She became combative and fell during the arrest." Davis nodded in agreement, already constructing the narrative that would protect them both. She was acting erratically and refused to comply with lawful orders. "We used minimum necessary force to subdue her." But their carefully rehearsed lies were worthless. Every second of the assault had been captured by the courthouse's sophisticated audio system and transmitted live to a national audience. There would be no covering up this brutality, no hiding behind false reports and police union protection. In the National Court Network studio, Rebecca Hayes stared at her monitor in disbelief. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice shaking, "we have just witnessed what appears to be an unprovoked assault by police officers on an unidentified woman outside the courtroom. We're going to continue our coverage as this situation develops." Across America, phones began ringing. Social media exploded with outrage. Civil rights organizations mobilized. The hashtag #ToscaJusticeForJudge began trending within minutes, though most people still didn't know the true identity of the woman bleeding on the courthouse floor. Victoria Williams lay unconscious, her blood staining the marble where justice was supposed to be served. In her briefcase, knocked from her hand during the assault, lay the judicial robe she had planned to wear while presiding over the trial of the officers who had killed her father. The irony was about to become clear to the entire nation. What happened next would be replayed in law schools, police academies, and civil rights seminars for decades to come. Bailiff James Brown knelt beside the unconscious woman, his experienced hands checking for vital signs while maintaining the crime scene. Blood continued to seep from the gash on her forehead, staining the pristine marble floor of Chicago's most prestigious courthouse. "Call 911 immediately," Brown commanded one of the court clerks who had rushed to the scene. "We need paramedics and detectives here now." Officer Thompson wiped sweat from his brow, his earlier confidence beginning to waver as he realized the magnitude of what had just occurred. The live broadcast had captured everything, every word, every moment of violence, every second of what was supposed to be a routine security encounter. "She was interfering with federal proceedings," Thompson repeated, as if saying it enough times would make it true. "We had to maintain order for the trial." Davis nodded vigorously, but his eyes betrayed growing concern. 12 million people had just watched them assault a woman on live television. This wasn't some back-alley encounter that could be explained away with creative report writing. Attorney Sarah Johnson pushed through the growing crowd of court personnel, her legal mind immediately recognizing the severity of the situation. "Nobody touch anything," she commanded. "This is now a crime scene, and everything needs to be preserved exactly as it is." Victoria Williams stirred slightly, a low moan escaping her lips as consciousness slowly returned. Her vision was blurry, and the taste of blood filled her mouth. The right side of her head throbbed with each heartbeat, and she could feel the warmth of blood trickling down her cheek. "Ma'am, please don't move," Bailiff Brown said gently. "You've been injured and medical help is on the way." Victoria blinked several times, trying to focus her vision. The faces surrounding her came into view, court personnel, security officers, and in the background the two policemen who had just assaulted her. The irony of the situation began to crystallize in her mind. She had come to this courthouse to seek justice for her father's death. Instead, she had become another victim of the same type of police violence that had destroyed her family 3 years ago. "My briefcase," Victoria whispered, her voice barely audible. "Where is my briefcase?" Brown looked around and spotted the leather briefcase that had been knocked from her hands during the assault. It lay several feet away, its contents partially spilled onto the marble floor. It's right here, ma'am, but you need to stay still until the paramedics arrive. Victoria tried to sit up, wincing from the pain shooting through her skull. Please, she said with growing urgency, I need my briefcase. Thompson scoffed from his position near the courtroom doors. Lady, you need medical attention, not your paperwork. You should be thanking us for not charging you with resisting arrest. The callousness of his words sent a ripple of anger through the assembled court personnel. Even other police officers present began to distance themselves from Thompson and Davis, recognizing that their actions had gone far beyond acceptable use of force. Brown retrieved the briefcase and knelt beside Victoria. What do you need from it? With shaking hands, Victoria reached into the briefcase and withdrew a folded black garment. The sight of it caused immediate confusion among the onlookers. It was clearly some kind of official clothing, but its significance wasn't immediately apparent. Help me stand, Victoria requested, her voice growing stronger despite her injuries. Ma'am, I really think you should wait for medical— Help me stand, she repeated with unmistakable authority. Brown and Sarah Johnson carefully assisted Victoria to her feet. She swayed slightly from the head injury, but managed to maintain her balance. Blood still streamed from her forehead, but her eyes were clear and focused with fierce determination. With deliberate ceremonial movements, Victoria unfolded the black garment and draped it over her shoulders. The gasps from the crowd were audible even through the live broadcast audio. It was a judicial robe. The recognition spread through the assembled group like wildfire. Court clerks covered their mouths in shock. Security guards stepped back in stunned disbelief. Attorney Sarah Johnson stared with growing understanding and horror. Oh my God, someone whispered. She's a judge. Officer Thompson's face went pale as the implications hit him like a physical blow. Officer Davis began backing away, as if distance could somehow undo what they had just done. Victoria Williams, blood still flowing from her wound, straightened her shoulders and looked directly at the two officers who had assaulted her. When she spoke, her voice carried the full weight of judicial authority. I am Judge Victoria Williams, she announced clearly, ensuring that every word would be captured by the live broadcast. I am the presiding judge for this courthouse, and I was scheduled to begin the most important trial of my career in this very courtroom. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the background noise of the courthouse seemed to cease, as the magnitude of what had occurred became clear to everyone present. Thompson's legs felt weak. He had just assaulted a sitting federal judge on live television in front of 12 million viewers. His career wasn't just over. His life as he knew it was finished. Furthermore, Victoria continued, her voice growing stronger with each word, the trial I was about to begin involves the death of Marcus Williams, my father, who was killed by police officers 3 years ago. The revelation hit the courthouse like a thunderbolt. The woman they had brutalized wasn't just any judge. She was the daughter of the very victim whose case was about to be tried. What happened next would redefine American justice forever. The courthouse fell into a silence so profound that the only sound was the steady drip of blood from Judge Victoria Williams' forehead onto the marble floor. 12 million Americans stared at their television screens in stunned disbelief, trying to process what they had just witnessed and heard. Judge Victoria Williams, still wearing her blood-stained blazer beneath the judicial robe, looked directly into the camera lens that was broadcasting this moment to the nation. Her next words would be quoted in legal textbooks, civil rights seminars, and congressional hearings for decades to come. 3 years ago, my father, retired Police Sergeant Marcus Williams, was killed during what the officers involved claimed was a routine traffic stop, she began, her voice steady despite the throbbing pain in her head. Those officers said he resisted arrest. They said he was combative. They said they had no choice but to use deadly force. Officer Thompson leaned against the courthouse wall, his face ashen as the full scope of his catastrophic mistake became clear. He had not only assaulted a federal judge on live television, he had assaulted the daughter of the victim in the very case she was about to preside over. The officers who killed my father filed reports claiming he attacked them, Victoria continued, blood still trickling down her cheek as she spoke. They said he reached for their weapons. They painted him as a dangerous criminal who brought about his own death through his actions. Officer Davis frantically whispered to his partner, "We need to call our union rep. We need to call him right now." But it was far too late for union representatives or damage control. Every second of their assault had been captured in high definition and broadcast to a national audience. There would be no explaining away this level of brutality against a sitting judge. Victoria Williams took a step forward, and the crowd of court personnel instinctively parted before her. Even injured and bleeding, she commanded absolute authority in her courthouse. "What you have just witnessed," she said, addressing both the people present and the millions watching at home, "is exactly what happened to my father." Two police officers decided that a black person didn't belong where they were, escalated a peaceful encounter into violence, and then justified their actions by claiming the victim was at fault. In the National Court Network studio, anchor Rebecca Hayes could barely speak. "Ladies and gentlemen," she managed to say, "we are witnessing what may be the most significant moment in modern American judicial history." Across the country, phones were ringing in every newsroom, every civil rights organization, and every law enforcement agency. The hashtag #JudgeWilliams Williams was trending worldwide within minutes. Videos of the assault were being shared millions of times across social media platforms. Attorney Sarah Johnson stepped forward, her legal mind working rapidly to understand the implications of what had just occurred. "Your Honor," she said formally, acknowledging Victoria's judicial status, "we need to get you medical attention immediately." Victoria raised her hand to stop the attorney's approach. "The medical attention can wait," she said firmly, "but justice cannot." She turned to face Officers Thompson and Davis directly, her bloodied face serving as a living testament to their brutality. "Officers, you have just committed assault and battery against a federal judge, while that assault was being broadcast live to the American people. But more than that, you have provided this nation with a perfect demonstration of how police violence begins, with the assumption that certain people don't belong in certain places." Thompson tried to speak, his voice cracking with desperation. "Your Honor, we didn't know, we had no idea you were—" "Exactly," Victoria interrupted, her judicial authority cutting through his excuses like a blade. "You didn't know who I was, so you felt entitled to assault me. The question this nation must now ask is, would your behavior have been acceptable if I had been anyone else? Would brutality be justified if I had been a court clerk, or a witness, or simply a citizen trying to observe justice in action?" The question hung in the air like a challenge to everything wrong with American policing. In living rooms across the country, viewers found themselves confronting uncomfortable truths about how quickly peaceful encounters could turn violent when certain assumptions were made about certain people. Bailiff James Brown approached cautiously, still concerned about Victoria's head injury. "Your Honor, the paramedics have arrived. Please let them examine you." Victoria nodded, but remained standing, addressing the cameras one final time before receiving medical treatment. "The trial that was supposed to begin today will still proceed," she announced. "I will still preside over the case involving my father's death, because justice delayed is justice denied. But now this trial will serve a dual purpose. It will not only seek accountability for my father's death, but it will also demonstrate to the American people what justice looks like when it is applied equally to everyone." She paused, looking directly at Thompson and Davis, including police officers who believe they are above the law. The paramedics approached with their equipment, but Victoria had one final statement to make to the nation. "What you have witnessed today is both the problem and the solution. The problem is officers who see brutality as their first option rather than their last resort. The solution is a justice system that holds everyone accountable, regardless of their uniform or their position." As the paramedics began treating her head wound, Victoria Williams had accomplished something unprecedented in American legal history. She had transformed a personal tragedy into a national teaching moment about justice, accountability, and the true meaning of law and order. The trial of the century was about to begin, but it would now include defendants who never expected to be judged. As paramedics carefully cleaned and bandaged Judge Victoria Williams' head wound, the entire nation was erupting in response to what they had witnessed. Phone lines at news stations were overwhelmed. Social media platforms were struggling to handle the unprecedented volume of posts, shares, and comments flooding their servers. In the National Court Network studio, anchor Rebecca Hayes was joined by legal analyst Dr. Patricia Henderson, a former federal prosecutor who specialized in police misconduct cases. "Dr. Henderson," Rebecca said, her voice still shaking from what they had broadcast. "In your 30 years of legal experience, have you ever seen anything like what we just witnessed?" "Doctor." Henderson removed her glasses, still processing the magnitude of the moment. "Rebecca, what we just saw represents a convergence of every issue plaguing American justice: police brutality, racial profiling, and the assumption that authority figures are above accountability. But it also represents something unprecedented: a sitting federal judge becoming a victim of the very type of violence she was about to adjudicate. Meanwhile, in the courthouse, Victoria Williams sat on a bench as paramedics finished treating her injury. The gash on her forehead required 7 stitches, but she had refused to be transported to a hospital. She had a trial to conduct, and nothing, not even her own assault, would prevent justice from moving forward. Officer Thompson stood in handcuffs, his earlier confidence completely shattered. The reality of his situation was sinking in. He had assaulted a federal judge on live television, while that judge was on her way to preside over a police brutality case. His career was over, his pension was forfeit, and he would likely spend years in federal prison. Officer Davis faced the same fate. Both men were being read their rights by FBI agents who had arrived within minutes of the assault. The Bureau had been monitoring the trial due to its national significance, and they were prepared to act immediately when federal crimes were committed. "Officer Thompson," Agent Maria Rodriguez said as she completed the Miranda warning, "you are under arrest for assault and battery against a federal judge, violation of civil rights under color of law, and obstruction of justice." "Officer Davis, you face the same charges." The irony was inescapable. These officers, who had arrived at the courthouse to provide security for a police brutality trial, were now defendants in their own police brutality case. Fellow attorney Sarah Johnson approached Judge Williams carefully. "Your Honor, with respect, I believe the court should consider postponing today's proceedings given what has occurred." Victoria looked up from the paramedics' work, her eyes clear and determined despite the fresh bandage on her forehead. "Counselor, justice has been delayed for 3 years since my father's death. It will not be delayed any longer." She stood up, testing her balance and finding it satisfactory. "This trial will proceed as scheduled. In fact, given what has just occurred, it is more important than ever that this trial proceed immediately." Across the country, the response to the assault was swift and overwhelming. In major cities from New York to Los Angeles, spontaneous demonstrations began forming outside federal courthouses and police stations. The signs read, "Justice for Judge Williams," and "No one is above the law." The White House issued a statement within the hour. "The President is deeply disturbed by the assault on Judge Victoria Williams and reaffirms his commitment to police accountability and judicial independence. Federal resources will be made available to ensure a thorough investigation and prosecution of this attack on our justice system." Congressional leaders from both parties condemned the assault. Senator Elizabeth Warren tweeted, "What we witnessed today is exactly why we need comprehensive police reform. No one, not judges, not citizens, should face brutality for simply existing while black." Even police chiefs across the nation were quick to distance themselves from Thompson and Davis. The Chicago police superintendent held an immediate press conference. "The actions of these officers do not represent the values of law enforcement. They will face the full consequences of their crimes. Comment your country and city below. Let's see where people stand for judicial integrity worldwide. Your participation shows that courtroom justice transcends borders." Back in the courthouse, Judge Williams was ready to transform this moment of violence into a lesson in justice. She entered her courtroom to find it packed beyond capacity. Every seat was filled with lawyers, journalists, civil rights advocates, and citizens who had witnessed the assault on television. The defendants in the original police brutality case, Officers Kevin Murphy and James Wilson, who had killed Marcus Williams 3 years earlier, sat at the defense table in stunned silence. They had expected to face questions about their use of force against an elderly retired police officer. They never expected to watch their colleagues assault the victim's daughter on live television. "All rise," Bailiff James Brown announced, as Judge Williams took the bench, the fresh bandage on her forehead serving as a visible reminder of what had just occurred. The Honorable Judge Victoria Williams presiding. The courtroom fell silent as Victoria looked out at the assembled crowd. When she spoke, her voice carried a weight that transcended the courthouse walls and reached every corner of America. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, "today was supposed to be about seeking justice for one act of police violence. Instead, it has become about seeking justice for two acts of police violence, one that occurred 3 years ago and one that occurred 30 minutes ago in the hallway outside this very courtroom." She paused, letting the words sink in. "But if we can find justice for both, then perhaps we can prevent future acts of violence from occurring at all." The trial that would reshape American policing was about to begin, and the entire nation was watching. Judge Victoria Williams adjusted her freshly donned judicial robe, the bandage on her forehead visible to everyone in the packed courtroom and to the millions still watching the live broadcast. The weight of history pressed down on the proceedings as she prepared to deliver her opening remarks. "Before we begin," Judge Williams announced, her voice carrying absolute authority despite the trauma she had just endured, "I want to address what has occurred this morning. I have been the victim of an assault by 2 police officers in the hallway of this courthouse. That assault was witnessed by millions of Americans through live television." She paused, scanning the faces in the courtroom, defendants, attorneys, spectators, and media representatives who were documenting every word. "Some might suggest that I should recuse myself from this case due to what has happened, but I will not. The assault I suffered 30 minutes ago demonstrates exactly why this trial is necessary, and why justice cannot be delayed or deterred by intimidation, whether that intimidation is intentional or not." Defense attorney Michael Richardson shifted uncomfortably at his table. His strategy for defending the officers who killed Marcus Williams had been built on the assumption that this would be a routine trial with limited public attention. Now, with 12 million Americans watching, and his client's colleagues having just committed an identical crime on live television, his entire approach was in ruins. "The case before us today," Judge Williams continued, "involves the death of Marcus Williams, a retired police sergeant who was killed during what officers claimed was a traffic stop gone wrong. The deceased was my father, a fact that is now public knowledge. However, my personal connection to this case will not prevent me from ensuring that justice is served fairly and completely." She looked directly at the defense table, where officers Kevin Murphy and James Wilson sat in obvious discomfort. "The defendants in this case have the right to a fair trial, regardless of what their colleagues have done today. They will receive that fair trial. But they will also face the full weight of justice if the evidence proves their guilt." Attorney Sarah Johnson rose to present her opening statement for the prosecution. She had been preparing for this moment for 3 years, but the events of the morning had given her case a power and urgency she had never anticipated. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Johnson began, 3 years ago, Marcus Williams was driving home from his grandson's birthday party when he was pulled over for what officers claimed was a broken taillight. Marcus Williams was a 25-year veteran of law enforcement who had never received a single complaint for excessive force during his entire career. She gestured toward a large monitor where body camera footage was prepared for display. "What you are about to see will show you exactly how a routine traffic stop became a killing, and how the same mentality that we witnessed in this courthouse 30 minutes ago led to the death of an innocent man." The courtroom was silent as Attorney Sarah Johnson prepared to show the jury the body camera footage that would expose the truth about Marcus Williams' death. She gestured toward the large monitor where the evidence was prepared for display. "What you are about to see will show you exactly how a routine traffic stop became a killing, and how the same mentality that we witnessed in this courthouse 30 minutes ago led to the death of an innocent man." The monitor flickered to life, displaying the timestamp. March 15, 2021, 8:47 p.m. The body camera belonged to Officer Kevin Murphy, one of the defendants now sitting at the defense table. The footage showed a quiet residential street, illuminated by streetlights and the police cruiser's headlights. Marcus Williams' silver sedan was pulled over near a park where children often played during the day. The 68-year-old retired sergeant sat calmly in his driver's seat, his hands visible on the steering wheel. exactly as police training teaches civilians to position themselves during traffic stops. "Good evening, sir," came Officer Murphy's voice through the camera's audio. "Do you know why I pulled you over tonight?" Marcus Williams' voice was clear and respectful. "No, officer, I don't. I was driving the speed limit and following all traffic laws." "Your left tail light is out," Murphy replied, though the camera footage clearly showed both tail lights functioning properly when Marcus had pulled over. "Officer, I just had my car inspected last week," Marcus responded politely. "I don't believe there's anything wrong with my tail lights." This was the moment, Attorney Johnson explained to the jury, when a routine traffic stop began its transformation into a death sentence. Instead of simply checking the tail light to verify the claimed violation, Officer Murphy became confrontational. "Are you arguing with me?" Murphy's voice carried an edge of aggression that would escalate rapidly. Officer James Wilson's voice could be heard in the background as he approached the passenger side of the vehicle. "We've got a resistant subject here, Kevin." Marcus Williams never raised his voice, never moved his hands from the steering wheel, never displayed any behavior that could reasonably be interpreted as threatening. Yet both officers were already treating him as a dangerous criminal rather than a respectful citizen. "Sir, I need you to step out of the vehicle," Murphy commanded. "Officer, may I ask why?" Marcus inquired. "If this is just about a taillight, couldn't you simply write me a citation?" The question was reasonable, lawful, and polite. Under the Fourth Amendment, citizens have the right to understand the reason for their detention. But Officer Murphy interpreted Marcus Williams's knowledge of his rights as defiance. "Step out of the vehicle now, or I'll remove you myself," Murphy threatened. Marcus Williams, drawing on his 25 years of police experience, recognized the dangerous escalation occurring. He attempted to de-escalate the situation using the same techniques he had once taught to rookie officers. "Officer, I'm a retired police sergeant from the 12th Precinct," Marcus said calmly. "I understand you're doing your job, but I don't believe I've committed any violation that requires me to exit my vehicle." This revelation should have caused both officers to reconsider their approach. A fellow law enforcement officer, even retired, deserved professional courtesy at minimum. Instead, it seemed to anger them further. "I don't care if you're the chief of police," Wilson shouted from the passenger side. "When we tell you to do something, you do it." The body camera footage captured the next crucial moments in devastating detail. Marcus Williams slowly reached for his wallet to show his retired police identification, moving deliberately and announcing his intentions. "I'm going to show you my retired police ID," he said clearly. "It's in my wallet in my back pocket." Officer Murphy later claimed that Marcus was reaching for a weapon, but the body camera footage proved this was a lie. Marcus Williams moved slowly, kept his other hand visible, and verbally announced exactly what he was doing. Textbook behavior for someone trying to avoid exactly what happened next. "Gun," Murphy shouted, though no weapon was visible in the footage. "Gun," Wilson echoed, both officers drawing their service weapons simultaneously. No, it's my wallet," Marcus Williams cried out, his hands immediately moving back to the steering wheel. "I'm showing you my police ID." But it was too late. The officers had already decided that Marcus Williams was a threat. The same mentality that led Thompson and Davis to assault Judge Williams in the courthouse hallway, the assumption that black people in certain situations must be dangerous, was about to prove fatal. "Get out of the car with your hands up," Murphy screamed, his weapon pointed directly at Marcus Williams's head. Marcus Williams, terrified but trying to comply, slowly opened his car door. His movements were careful and deliberate, but the officer's adrenaline and bias had already sealed his fate. As he stepped out of the vehicle with his hands raised, Officer Wilson claimed he saw Marcus lunging toward Murphy. The body camera footage clearly showed Marcus Williams standing still with his hands in the air, but Wilson fired 3 shots into his back. Marcus Williams collapsed on the asphalt, dying in the same park where he had taken his grandchildren to play just hours earlier. The courtroom was silent as the footage ended. Several jurors were visibly shaken by what they had witnessed. Judge Victoria Williams maintained her composure, but the parallel between her father's death and her own assault was unmistakable. "Ladies and gentlemen," Attorney Johnson said quietly, "what you have just seen is the same mentality that led to the assault on Judge Williams this morning. The assumption that black people don't belong, that our questions are defiance, that our presence is threatening. Defense attorney Richardson knew his case was in ruins before it had even begun. Defense attorney Michael Richardson rose slowly from his table, knowing that the body camera footage had demolished any hope of defending his client successfully. The parallels between Marcus Williams's death and Judge Williams's assault were so obvious that even the most sympathetic jury would struggle to ignore them. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Richardson began, his voice lacking its usual confidence, "what you have just seen is a tragic incident that occurred during a lawful traffic stop. My clients, Officers Murphy and Wilson, were following established police procedures when they encountered what they reasonably believed to be a dangerous situation." Several jurors exchanged skeptical glances. The body camera footage had clearly shown Marcus Williams complying with every police command, while the officers escalated the situation unnecessarily. Richardson continued, "Police officers must make split-second decisions in potentially life-threatening situations. They cannot afford to hesitate when they believe their lives are in danger." Judge Williams leaned forward slightly, her bandaged forehead catching the courtroom lights. "Counselor, are you suggesting that a man sitting in his car with his hands on the steering wheel posed a life-threatening danger to two armed police officers?" Richardson hesitated. The question was perfectly legal and within the judge's authority, but it cut directly to the heart of his defense strategy's weakness. "Your Honor, the officers perceived a threat based on the the deceased's refusal to immediately comply with lawful orders." "Counselor," Judge Williams interrupted, her voice carrying the weight of personal experience, "I want you to be very careful about how you characterize Mr. Marcus Williams' behavior. The jury has seen the footage. They can determine for themselves whether asking for clarification constitutes refusal to comply." Attorney Sarah Johnson objected. "Your Honor, I believe the defense is mischaracterizing the evidence that was just presented." "Sustained," Judge Williams ruled immediately. "Mr. Richardson, please stick to the facts as shown in the evidence, not your interpretation of what the officers might have been thinking." Richardson's strategy was falling apart in real time. He had planned to argue that Marcus Williams' behavior justified the officers' response, but the body camera footage made that argument impossible to sustain credibly. Meanwhile, outside the courthouse, the demonstrations that had begun after Judge Williams's assault were growing larger by the hour. Protesters carried signs reading, "Justice for Marcus" and "Judge Williams stands for justice." News crews from every major network had arrived to cover what was being called the most significant police accountability trial in American history. Back in the courtroom, Richardson attempted to pivot to his backup strategy. "Ladies and gentlemen, police work is inherently dangerous. Officers Murphy and Wilson had to make decisions based on their training and experience in a rapidly evolving situation." Judge Williams interrupted again. "Mr. Richardson, I'm going to ask you to be more specific. What aspect of their training taught them to draw weapons on a man sitting peacefully in his car?" The question hung in the air like a sword over Richardson's defense. He knew that police training actually emphasized de-escalation and proportional response, the exact opposite of what his clients had done. "Your Honor, I would argue that the officer's perception of threat was reasonable given the circumstances." "Which circumstances specifically?" Judge Williams pressed. "A 68-year-old man sitting in his car. A man who identified himself as a retired police officer. A man who was attempting to show identification when ordered to exit his vehicle." Richardson realized he was being systematically dismantled by a judge who understood police procedure better than most attorneys, because she had just experienced the same type of unjustified police violence herself. Attorney Johnson rose for her cross-examination of the first defense witness, Officer Murphy himself. She had been preparing for this moment for 3 years, but the morning's events had given her questions a devastating new context. "Officer Murphy," Johnson began, "how many years of police training did you receive before becoming a sworn officer?" 6 months at the academy, plus field training," Murphy replied, his voice barely audible. "And during that training, were you taught that citizens have the right to ask questions during traffic stops?" Murphy shifted uncomfortably. "Yes, but they also have to comply with lawful orders." "Officer Murphy, What lawful order did Marcus Williams refuse to comply with? The question was simple, but Murphy couldn't answer it honestly without admitting that Marcus Williams had done nothing wrong. He was argumentative and uncooperative, Murphy said weakly. Officer Murphy, you've seen the body camera footage. Can you point to any moment where Marcus Williams raised his voice, used profanity, or displayed aggressive behavior? Murphy stared at his hands. No, but his attitude. His attitude, Johnson interrupted. Officer Murphy, is it illegal to have an attitude? No, but when someone acts suspicious, what suspicious behavior did Marcus Williams display? Sitting in his car, keeping his hands visible? Attempting to show identification when requested. Richardson objected desperately. Your Honor, counsel is badgering the witness. Overruled, Judge Williams said firmly. The witness will answer the question. Murphy looked toward his attorney for help, but Richardson had no assistance to offer. The truth was too obvious to deny. He reached toward his pocket, Murphy finally said. After announcing that he was going to show you his retired police identification, Johnson replied. Officer Murphy, if someone tells you exactly what they're going to do before they do it, how is that suspicious behavior? The silence that followed was deafening. Murphy had no answer that wouldn't condemn him further. Judge Williams looked at the defendant with a mixture of disappointment and determination. Officer Murphy, you killed a man for reaching for his wallet. Today your colleagues assaulted a federal judge for walking down a courthouse hallway. When will you learn that being black is not a crime? The question would be quoted in newspapers around the world. Attorney Sarah Johnson approached the evidence table, where a collection of items told the story of Marcus Williams' final moments. Each piece of evidence contradicted the officer's official reports and exposed the systematic lies that had initially protected them from accountability. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Johnson announced, I want to show you the items that were found in Marcus Williams' car after he was killed. These items will prove beyond any doubt that Officers Murphy and Wilson were never in danger. She held up a clear evidence bag containing a worn leather wallet. This is what Marcus Williams was reaching for when Officer Murphy claimed he was grabbing a weapon. Inside this wallet, you will find his retired police identification, his driver's license, and photographs of his grandchildren. Johnson opened the wallet carefully, displaying its contents to the jury. There is no weapon, there never was a weapon. Marcus Williams was reaching for his police ID to de-escalate the situation. Exactly what any reasonable person would do when confronted by aggressive officers. She moved to the next piece of evidence. This is the medical examiner's report on Marcus Williams' death. The autopsy shows that all 3 bullets struck him in the back, proving that he was not lunging toward the officers as they claimed. He was standing still with his hands raised when Officer Wilson executed him. Judge Williams watched the proceedings with intense focus, her bandaged forehead serving as a constant reminder of how quickly police encounters could turn violent. The parallels between her father's death and her own assault were becoming more obvious with each piece of evidence. Johnson continued her presentation. The officers claimed in their initial reports that Marcus Williams was combative and uncooperative. But we have the complete audio from both body cameras, and not once, not even when he was being shot, did Marcus Williams raise his voice or use profane language. She played another segment of audio where Marcus Williams' final words could be heard clearly. Please don't shoot me. I'm a retired police officer. I have grandchildren. The courtroom was silent, except for the sound of several jurors weeping quietly. Defense attorney Richardson knew his case was hopeless, but he was obligated to mount some defense for his clients. He rose for his cross-examination of the medical examiner, Dr. Patricia Hernandez. Dr. Hernandez, Richardson began, is it possible that the deceased could have been moving toward the officers at the moment he was shot, even though the bullets struck him in the back? Dr. Hernandez, a veteran forensic pathologist with 30 years of experience, looked at Richardson with barely concealed disgust. Counselor, the bullet trajectory analysis shows that Marcus Williams was standing stationary with his hands raised above his head when he was shot. The angle of entry and the spacing of the wounds make any other scenario physically impossible. Richardson pressed on desperately. But could he have been turning around at the moment of impact? No, Doctor. Hernandez replied firmly. The evidence is conclusive. Marcus Williams was facing away from the officers with his hands in the air when Officer Wilson fired 3 shots into his back. This was an execution, not self-defense. The word execution echoed through the courtroom like a gavel striking wood. Even Judge Williams, who had maintained perfect judicial composure throughout the trial, closed her eyes briefly as the reality of her father's murder was confirmed by scientific evidence. Johnson called her next witness, Detective Rebecca Thompson from Internal Affairs, who had investigated the initial incident. Thompson took the stand with obvious reluctance. Her testimony would expose the cover-up that had initially protected Murphy and Wilson. Detective Thompson, Johnson began, when you first investigated this shooting, what did Officers Murphy and Wilson tell you happened? Thompson consulted her notes, though she clearly remembered the lies she had been told. They claimed that Marcus Williams had refused to comply with orders, became physically aggressive, and lunged at Officer Murphy with what appeared to be a weapon. And based on their statements, what was your initial finding? Thompson's voice was barely audible. I ruled the shooting justified based on the officers' reports. Detective Thompson, have you since reviewed the body camera footage? Yes. And does that footage support the officers' version of events? Thompson stared at her hands. No, the footage proves that everything they told me was a lie. Johnson pressed the advantage. Detective, would you say that Officers Murphy and Wilson deliberately provided false information to obstruct your investigation? Yes. They committed perjury and obstruction of justice. Judge Williams leaned forward. Detective Thompson, why wasn't this footage reviewed during your initial investigation? The question cut to the heart of police corruption. Thompson shifted uncomfortably before answering. Your Honor, the officers claimed their body cameras malfunctioned during the incident. It wasn't until the family's attorney filed a federal lawsuit that we discovered the footage had been archived in a separate system. The revelation sent shockwaves through the courtroom. Not only had the officers lied about the shooting, but they had also concealed evidence that would have immediately exposed their lies. Judge Williams's voice carried a cold fury that chilled everyone present. Detective Thompson, are you telling this court that police officers can simply claim their cameras malfunctioned and avoid accountability for their actions? Your Honor, we've since implemented new protocols to prevent... Detective Thompson, Judge Williams interrupted. How many other cases might have been affected by similar malfunctions? The question hung in the air like an indictment of the entire system. Thompson had no answer that wouldn't expose years of potential cover-ups. As the detective left the stand, it was clear that this trial had become about more than just 2 officers who killed Marcus Williams. It was about a system that had protected those officers, hidden evidence, and allowed them to continue working despite being murderers. The jury had heard enough. Justice was about to be served. After 3 hours of deliberation, the jury returned to the courtroom. The foreman, a retired teacher named Robert Martinez, held the verdict in his hands with the weight of history. 12 million Americans were still watching the live broadcast, and the entire nation waited to see whether justice would finally be served. Judge Victoria Williams took her seat at the bench, the bandage on her forehead, now a symbol of police accountability that had spread across social media worldwide. The hashtag Judge Williams Justice was trending in 17 countries. Has the jury reached a verdict? Judge Williams asked formally. We have, Your Honor, Martinez replied, his voice steady and clear. In the case of the People versus Officer Kevin Murphy, on the charge of second-degree murder, how do you find? Martinez looked directly at Officer Murphy before answering. We find the defendant guilty. The courtroom erupted in a mixture of gasps, applause, and tears. Murphy's face went pale as the reality of a murder conviction sank in. His police career was over, and he faced decades in prison. In the case of the People versus Officer James Wilson, on the charge of second-degree murder, how do you find? We find the defendant guilty. Wilson collapsed into his chair, his attorney's hand on his shoulder providing little comfort. Both officers had been convicted of murdering Marcus Williams, one of the first times in American history that police officers had been held accountable for killing a black man during what they claimed was a justified shooting. But Judge Williams wasn't finished. She had one more case to address, the assault that had occurred in her own courthouse just hours earlier. Bailiff Brown, please bring in the defendants Thompson and Davis. The two officers who had assaulted Judge Williams were escorted into the courtroom in handcuffs and orange jumpsuits. Their booking photos had already been shared millions of times on social media, making them the faces of police brutality in America. Officers Thompson and Davis, Judge Williams began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had faced their violence and survived. You have been charged with assault and battery against a federal judge, violation of civil rights under color of law, and obstruction of justice. How do you plead? Thompson's attorney, clearly overwhelmed by the circumstances, whispered urgently in his client's ear. The entire assault had been broadcast live to millions of people. There was no possible defense. Your Honor, Thompson's attorney said finally, my client pleads guilty to all charges. Davis followed immediately. Your Honor, my client also pleads guilty to all charges. The guilty pleas eliminated the need for another trial, but Judge Williams had something more important than legal proceedings in mind. She was about to deliver a statement that would be studied in law schools and quoted by civil rights leaders for generations. Officers Thompson and Davis, she began, standing from her judicial bench to address them directly. Your assault on me this morning was witnessed by 12 million Americans. But your crime represents more than just an attack on one individual. It represents an attack on the very concept of justice itself. She paused, letting her words resonate through the packed courtroom and across the television screens of millions of viewers. When you grabbed me in that hallway, you did so because you saw a black woman and assumed she didn't belong in a place of justice. When you slammed me against that door, you did so because you believed your authority superseded my rights. When you left me bleeding on the marble floor of this courthouse, you did so because you never considered that the person you were brutalizing might be the very judge you were supposed to protect. Thompson stared at the floor, unable to meet Judge Williams' eyes. Davis appeared to be fighting back tears as the magnitude of his actions became clear. But here is what you failed to understand, Judge Williams continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. Justice does not depend on who you think deserves it. Justice is not reserved for people who look like you, act like you, or share your assumptions about who belongs where. Justice is universal, or it is meaningless. She gestured toward the camera that was broadcasting her words to the nation. What America witnessed today was both the problem and the solution. The problem is officers who see violence as their first option rather than their last resort. The solution is a justice system that holds everyone accountable, regardless of their uniform or their position. Judge Williams returned to her seat and addressed both sets of defendants, the officers who had killed her father and the officers who had assaulted her. Officers Murphy and Wilson, you are hereby sentenced to 25 years to life in federal prison without the possibility of parole. Your actions took the life of a good man, a devoted father, and a public servant who dedicated his career to protecting others. She turned to Thompson and Davis. Officers Thompson and Davis, you are hereby sentenced to 10 years in federal prison and lifetime prohibition from law enforcement employment. Your actions were witnessed by the entire nation and serve as a perfect example of how not to serve and protect. But Judge Williams had one final statement to make, one that would transform this moment from a legal proceeding into a national call for justice. To the police officers watching this broadcast, she said, looking directly into the camera, understand that what happened here today is not an attack on law enforcement. It is a defense of what law enforcement should be. Good officers have nothing to fear from accountability. Only bad officers need to hide behind the badge instead of honoring it. The gavel came down with finality, but the impact of Judge Williams' justice would resonate far beyond the courthouse walls. Within hours of the verdicts, the impact of Judge Williams' trial was being felt across every level of American law enforcement and government. The live broadcast had created an unprecedented moment of accountability that could not be ignored, covered up, or explained away. In Washington, D.C., emergency sessions were being called in Congress. Senator Elizabeth Warren was drafting what would become known as the Marcus Williams Police Accountability Act. Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was demanding federal oversight of police departments nationwide. Even conservative Republicans were acknowledging that something fundamental needed to change. President Biden addressed the nation from the Oval Office that evening. What we witnessed in Judge Victoria Williams' courtroom today represents both the worst and the best of American justice. We saw the worst when police officers committed brutal acts of violence, but we also saw the best when our justice system held those officers accountable, regardless of their badges or their assumptions about who deserves protection under the law. The Chicago Police Department was in complete crisis. Superintendent Robert Johnson had called an emergency meeting of all precinct commanders, knowing that the department's reputation had been destroyed by the actions of 4 officers who thought they were above the law. Effective immediately, Johnson announced to his commanders, every officer in this department will undergo mandatory retraining in de-escalation, cultural sensitivity, and constitutional law. Any officer who cannot pass these requirements will be dismissed without pension benefits. The police union, which had initially planned to defend Thompson and Davis, quickly reversed course when they realized that public opinion had turned decisively against them. Union President Michael Rodriguez issued a statement. The actions of these officers do not represent the values of the Chicago Police Department or law enforcement in general. We support Judge Williams and her commitment to justice for all. But the changes weren't limited to Chicago. Police departments across America were implementing immediate reforms to avoid being associated with the type of brutality that had been exposed on live television. In New York, Police Commissioner Sarah Martinez announced mandatory body cameras for all officers and civilian oversight of all use-of-force incidents. In Los Angeles, Chief Roberto Gonzalez implemented a new policy requiring officers to intervene when they witnessed colleagues using excessive force. The FBI announced a sweeping investigation into police departments nationwide, focusing specifically on cases where body camera footage had mysteriously malfunctioned during controversial incidents. Director Christopher Wray stated, "The American people deserve to know how many other cases like Marcus Williams' death have been covered up by deliberate evidence suppression." Back in Chicago, Judge Williams returned to her chambers after the most significant day of her legal career. The bandage on her forehead had been replaced with a smaller one, but the symbolism remained powerful. She had become the face of judicial courage and police accountability in America. Her assistant, Maria Gonzalez, brought her a stack of messages that had poured in throughout the day. "Your Honor, you've received calls from the Supreme Court, the Department of Justice, and over 50 civil rights organizations. The President wants to meet with you personally." Judge Williams sat down heavily in her chair, the emotional and physical toll of the day finally catching up with her. "Maria, all I wanted was justice for my father. I never intended to become a symbol of anything." "Your Honor," Maria replied gently, "sometimes history chooses us rather than the other way around. What you did today, presiding over that trial despite your own assault, refusing to let violence intimidate justice, that's what leadership looks like." Outside the courthouse, the demonstrations that had begun after Judge Williams's assault had transformed into celebrations of justice. Thousands of people gathered with candles, holding signs that read, "Thank you, Judge Williams," and "Justice finally served." Civil rights leader Revers Al Sharpton addressed the crowd. "What we witnessed today proves that justice is possible when we have judges who are committed to the law rather than to protecting the powerful. Judge Victoria Williams has shown us what courage looks like." The family of Marcus Williams held their own press conference outside the courthouse. Marcus's widow, Eleanor Williams, spoke through tears. "My husband served this community for 25 years as a police officer. He believed in justice, and he would be proud to see that justice finally prevailed in this courtroom today. But perhaps the most significant change was happening within police departments themselves. Young officers who had joined law enforcement to serve and protect were speaking out against the culture of violence and cover-ups that had protected officers like Murphy, Wilson, Thompson, and Davis. Officer Janet Martinez, a rookie in Chicago PD, posted a video on social media that went viral. "I became a police officer to help people, not to hurt them." What happened to Judge Williams and her father represents everything wrong with policing. We need to do better, and that starts with officers like me refusing to stay silent when we see abuse. The video was shared by thousands of police officers across the country, creating a movement within law enforcement itself. Major police academies began updating their training curricula to include extensive education about implicit bias, constitutional rights, and de-escalation techniques. The standard warrior mentality training that had produced officers like Thompson and Davis was being replaced with guardian mentality training that emphasized protection and service. Corporate America was also responding to the moment. Major companies began requiring police accountability clauses in any contracts with law enforcement agencies. Sports teams, entertainment companies, and technology firms announced they would only work with police departments that had implemented comprehensive reform programs. The transformation that Judge Williams had triggered was becoming unstoppable, spreading through every institution in American society. But the most important change was in the minds and hearts of ordinary Americans who had witnessed justice triumph over brutality on live television. 6 months after the trial that changed America, Judge Victoria Williams stood in the same courthouse where she had been assaulted by officers Thompson and Davis. But now, instead of a bandage on her forehead, she wore a small scar that had become a symbol of resilience and justice worldwide. The courthouse had been renamed the Marcus Williams Federal Courthouse in honor of her father, and a bronze plaque in the marble hallway marked the exact spot where she had been attacked and where she had chosen to fight back with law rather than violence. The Marcus Williams Police Accountability Act had passed Congress with bipartisan support, creating federal oversight of police departments, mandatory federal prosecution of police brutality cases, and a national database of officers dismissed for misconduct. President Biden had signed the legislation in a ceremony attended by Judge Williams and dozens of families who had lost loved ones to police violence. Officers Murphy and Wilson were serving their life sentences in federal prison, where they had become symbols of what happened to police officers who believed they were above the law. Officers Thompson and Davis were also imprisoned, their case studied in police academies as an example of how quickly a career could be destroyed by a single act of brutality. But the most significant changes were happening in communities across America, where the relationship between police and citizens was being rebuilt on foundations of accountability and mutual respect. In Chicago, crime rates had actually decreased after the police reforms were implemented. Community policing programs brought officers and residents together for problem-solving rather than confrontation. Young people who had once feared police were now participating in citizen review boards and police training programs. Detective Rebecca Thompson, who had initially covered up Marcus Williams' murder, had been demoted and reassigned to a desk job. But she had also become an advocate for police reform, traveling to departments across the country to explain how the culture of protecting bad officers ultimately destroyed good officers' ability to serve effectively. "I spent 15 years enabling police brutality by looking the other way," Thompson told a conference of police chiefs in Atlanta. "Judge Williams taught me that accountability makes us stronger, not weaker. When we hold bad officers responsible, we protect the integrity of good officers." The National Court Network had won a Pulitzer Prize for their live coverage of Judge Williams's trial, but more importantly, they had established a new standard for transparency in judicial proceedings. Courts across America were now broadcasting high-profile cases live, ensuring that justice could not be hidden from public view. Rebecca Hayes, the anchor who had guided the nation through that historic day, interviewed Judge Williams on the 6-month anniversary of the trial. "Judge Williams," Hayes asked, "when you walked into that courthouse 6 months ago, did you imagine that your personal tragedy would become a catalyst for national change?" Judge Williams, now wearing her full judicial robes with quiet dignity, considered the question carefully. "Rebecca, I learned that day that justice isn't something that happens to us. It's something we make happen. My father's death could have been meaningless if I had allowed his killers to escape accountability. My own assault could have been just another example of police brutality if I had chosen to step aside instead of fighting back." She paused, looking directly into the camera that had captured her moment of truth 6 months earlier. "But when we choose justice over comfort, accountability over protection, truth over convenience, that's when we honor not just the victims of brutality, but the promise of what America can become. The interview was being watched by millions of Americans, including police officers who had changed their approach to law enforcement after witnessing Judge Williams's courage. Officer Janet Martinez, who had spoken out against police brutality after the trial, was now training new recruits in constitutional policing. Judge Williams showed us that being a police officer means protecting everyone, including people who look different from us, think different from us, or challenge us, she told her trainees. The badge is a symbol of service, not superiority. In schools across America, Judge Williams' story was being taught as an example of how one person's courage could transform an entire system. Students were learning about the Constitution, civil rights, and the importance of speaking truth to power. The Marcus Williams Foundation, established by Judge Williams to support families affected by police violence, had already helped hundreds of families navigate the legal system and find justice for their loved ones. But more importantly, it was working with police departments to implement the kind of reforms that could prevent future tragedies. As Judge Williams concluded her interview, she had one final message for the nation that had watched her transform personal pain into social progress. 6 months ago, I was a daughter seeking justice for her father's murder, she said. Today, I am a judge who has seen our system work the way it was always supposed to work, without fear or favor, without regard to the color of someone's skin or the uniform they wear. She looked directly into the camera, addressing every viewer personally. The question isn't whether our justice system is perfect. The question is whether we have the courage to make it better. And if the past 6 months have proven anything, it's that Americans do have that courage when we choose to use it. The legacy of Judge Victoria Williams would continue to inspire generations of Americans to choose justice over convenience, courage over comfort, and accountability over protection. Her father's death had meaning. Her assault had purpose, and America was better because she had chosen to fight back with law rather than violence. Justice had prevailed. Thank you to everyone who typed justice and shared their locations from around the globe. From New York to London, from Toronto to Sydney, you've proven that the fight for judicial dignity is universal. If this story moved you, please subscribe for more incredible tales of justice prevailing over abuse of power. Until next time, remember that true authority comes from respecting the law, not breaking it.